Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered at least 17 men and boys, most of whom were young, gay, and people of color. He was known for his gruesome methods of killing and disposing of his victims, which included cannibalism, dismemberment, and necrophilia. Despite his horrific crimes, Dahmer was able to evade capture for many years, leaving law enforcement authorities baffled and frustrated. However, a combination of police work, luck, and the bravery of one of Dahmer's would-be victims led to his eventual capture. And in this video, we'll be going through some of the sordid details. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the older of two sons, born to Lionel Herbert Dahmer, who was a research chemist, and Joyce Annette Dahmer, who was a teletype machine instructor. From an early age, Dahmer was an odd child, displaying fascination with dead animals and a penchant for collecting roadkill. And according to several sources, the parents didn't pay much attention to him, which gave him all the time to explore his hobbies. He was also known for being socially awkward and introverted, which made it difficult for him to make friends. However, there was probably nobody that thought that beneath the social awkwardness and weird fascination with dead animals was something very sinister. In 1978, when Dahmer was just 18 years old and fresh out of high school, he committed his first murder. The victim was a hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks, whom Dahmer lured back to his parents' home for a few beers. There were beers, quite all right, but then there was death because Dahmer didn't want Hicks to leave. He then dismembered Hicks' body and buried the remains in the woods behind the house. This would be the first of many murders that Dahmer would commit over the next 13 years. Dahmer's other killings pretty much mirrored the first one. His modus operandi was to lure young men and boys to his apartment, many of whom were struggling with drug addiction or homelessness. While at his apartment, Dahmer would then drug them with sleeping pills and strangle them. After killing his victims, he would often engage in sexual acts with their bodies, dismember them, and keep their body parts as souvenirs. And sometimes he would even consume parts of their flesh. While Dahmer's crimes were gruesome, they went unnoticed for many years, in part because he was careful to choose victims who were unlikely to be missed. As I mentioned earlier, his victims were usually homeless young men. But he was also able to evade capture because he often moved around, making it difficult for police to connect the crimes. However, in 1988, Dahmer had his first close call with the law. He had picked up a teenager and brought him back to his apartment. Dahmer drugged the teen and then began to fondle him. He didn't kill this one, though, and was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling the teenager. But his father hired an attorney to defend him, and the attorney recommended that Dahmer undergo psychological evaluations before his court hearings. Regardless of the results, which showed that Dahmer was impulsive and suffered from a schizoid personality disorder, he pled guilty to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. He was then sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction. This run-in with the law was not enough to bridle Dahmer's unfortunate passions, though. So, in the time between his conviction and the sentencing, he managed to lure and murder another young man. And according to Dahmer himself, this was the first victim whose body parts he kept. But law enforcement was none the wiser. 1991 was the year when the cookie started to crumble for Dahmer. First off, fellow residents of the Oxford apartments where he resided had been repeatedly complaining to the building's manager that foul smells were coming out of apartment 213, Dahmer's apartment. They also complained about sounds of falling objects and the occasional sound of a chainsaw coming out of that same apartment. Dahmer was confronted about this several times by the building manager, but he always talked his way out of the complaints. Then, on May 27, 1991, Dahmer was almost caught by police when he lured a 14-year-old boy into his apartment. Dahmer drugged the teen and began to drill a hole in his skull, intending to lobotomize him. However, the teenager eventually woke up and managed to escape from the apartment, running out into the street, naked and bleeding. Dahmer was not around when this escape happened, but when he came back, he saw the young boy talking with 3 women on the streets. Dahmer tried to take the young boy back to his house, telling the ladies that he was his friend, but the ladies were understandably suspicious and decided to keep the boy with them and call 911 instead. Unfortunately, Dahmer managed to convince the officers when they arrived that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, who was drunk, and that they were just having a lover's quarrel. The officers believed Dahmer and handed the boy back to him. Despite multiple protests by the women and some members of the fire department who came to the scene later, Dahmer made sure to kill the boy that night. Then, in July 1991, A young man, Tracy Edwards, was walking on the street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin when he was approached by Dahmer, who offered him money to come to his apartment and pose for some photographs. Once they arrived at Dahmer's apartment, Edwards noticed several disturbing things, including a foul odor and the sight of photographs of dismembered bodies. Dahmer attempted to do what he usually did with his victims, but Edwards managed to fight back and escape. He found a pair of police officers and led them back to Dahmer's apartment. This time around, the police officers did the right thing. They followed Edwards to Dahmer's house and were able to find several incriminating pieces of evidence, including several Polaroid pictures of dismembered human bodies and the freshly severed head of a black man. Dahmer initially tried to resist arrest, but it was just him against two armed policemen. A later, more detailed search of his apartment showed that there were 4 more severed heads, 7 skulls, 2 human hearts, and a couple of other body parts and flesh in the refrigerator and freezer. With all of that evidence, it was pretty easy to charge Dahmer with multiple counts of murder, sexual assault, and cannibalism. On his part, Dahmer waived his rights to an attorney during his interrogations, mentioning that he wanted to confess all. So he admitted to having killed 16 young men since 1987. He also admitted to eating and planning to eat some of his victims' body parts as a way to keep them as a permanent part of himself. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992, and because Dahmer pled guilty, there was no need for a trial to establish guilt, according to Wisconsin law. There was still a bit of an argument between the prosecution and defense, though, based on Dahmer's mental illness. The defense argued that the mental illness rendered Dahmer incapable of controlling his actions, while the prosecution argued, well, the opposite. But a professional forensic psychiatrist testified that Dahmer's killings were methodical and controlled and in no way hampered by his mental condition. So in February 1992, Dahmer was ruled to be sane during his activities and was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also sentenced to an additional 16th life term for a murder he committed in Ohio. All his sentences amounted to 957 years behind bars. Dahmer served his sentence at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he was initially segregated from other inmates for his safety, but on November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, who claimed to have been obeying the voice of God. A somewhat full circle moment, right? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Have a nice day and see you at the next one.